In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Brooksville, the residents believed they knew everything about each other. Families who had lived there for generations shared a strong bond. It was a place where people prided themselves on their close-knit community, free from scandals or secrets. That was until the shocking murder of Richard Alton shattered this illusion and revealed a web of deceit that no one had seen coming. Richard Alton was a well-respected man in the community. At 45, he had built a successful career as a real estate agent, was an active member of the local church, and to all appearances had a loving marriage with his wife, Lisa. The couple had been married for over 20 years and were considered a model couple by their neighbors. They had 2 children, both away at college, leaving them with an empty nest. It seemed like they were finally getting time to themselves after years of raising a family. Beneath this seemingly perfect life, Lisa Alton was restless. At 41, she was struggling with a sense of emptiness and unfulfilled desires. She had spent her entire adult life supporting Richard's ambitions, raising their children, and conforming to the expectations of a suburban wife. With her children gone, the cracks in her marriage became more apparent. Richard was often away on business, and when he was home, he was distant, more interested in his work than in his wife. The loneliness ate away at Lisa, and she found herself seeking solace in unexpected places. Next door to the Altons lived the Harris family. They had a teenage son named Ethan, who had recently turned 19. Ethan was a college student on summer break, spending his days working part-time at the local grocery store and his evenings with friends. He was young, charming, and to Lisa's eyes, a breath of fresh air. What started as innocent conversations over the garden fence quickly escalated into something much more dangerous. Lisa and Ethan began a torrid affair, sneaking around while Richard was away, meeting in secret locations, and eventually in the Alton house itself. For Ethan, it was an exciting fling, a thrilling secret that he could brag about to his friends. For Lisa, it was an escape, a chance to feel desired and alive again. They both knew the risks, but the temptation was too strong to resist. They believed they were careful, that no one could possibly suspect what was happening behind closed doors. But in a neighborhood as close-knit as Brooksville, secrets never stayed hidden for long. It was on a humid July evening that things began to unravel. Richard, who had been away on a business trip, returned home unexpectedly. Tired and eager to surprise his wife, he didn't call ahead. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed something strange. The lights in their bedroom were dimmed, and the curtains were drawn, something Lisa rarely did. His heart raced as he quietly unlocked the door and stepped inside. As he climbed the stairs, he heard muffled voices coming from the bedroom. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. Bursting through the door, he found Lisa in a compromising position with Ethan. The scene was surreal, a nightmarish moment that froze him in place. Lisa screamed, and Ethan scrambled to cover himself, his face turning white as he stammered apologies. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Richard, devastated and enraged, shouted at Lisa, demanding to know how she could betray him with a boy barely older than their own children. Ethan, terrified, tried to leave, but Richard blocked his way, hurling insults and threats. The situation escalated as Richard, consumed by fury, lunged at Ethan, throwing a punch that sent him sprawling to the floor. Lisa, desperate to calm her husband, pleaded for him to stop, but it was too late. Ethan managed to escape the house, bruised and humiliated, while Lisa was left to face Richard's wrath. The argument continued late into the night, with accusations, tears, and broken promises. Richard threatened to expose everything, to destroy Ethan's life, and to leave Lisa with nothing. He was a man undone, his world shattered by the betrayal of the 2 people he trusted most. The neighbors heard the shouting but dismissed it as a marital spat, unaware that this was the beginning of a tragedy that would shock them all. The morning after the explosive confrontation, Brooksville was abuzz with rumors. Neighbors had noticed Ethan's bruised face and shaken demeanor as he left his house early that morning. Whispers spread quickly, but no one could have guessed what was truly going on behind the Alton family's closed doors. Lisa spent the day in a daze replaying the events in her mind. She felt a crushing guilt, not just for betraying Richard, but for dragging Ethan into the chaos. She tried to reach out to Ethan multiple times, but he didn't respond. He was terrified, and she couldn't blame him. She knew Richard wouldn't let this go, and that fear gnawed at her. Richard, meanwhile, was consumed by rage. He stayed home that day, nursing his anger and plotting his next move. He wasn't just going to let his wife and that boy get away with this. His mind raced with thoughts of revenge, but one thing was clear: Ethan needed to pay. It was late afternoon when he finally left the house, his expression dark and determined. He drove to a local hardware store, his mind spinning with plans. He purchased a few items: a roll of duct tape, a length of heavy rope, and a large, sharp hunting knife. The cashier eyed him suspiciously, but Richard, seething and lost in thought, barely noticed. He drove back home, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his mind set on what he needed to do. That night, Lisa tried to talk to Richard, to apologize, to beg for his forgiveness, but he wouldn't hear it. He barely spoke a word, his silence more terrifying than his anger. Lisa's heart pounded with fear as she watched him pace around the house, his eyes distant and cold. When he finally went to bed, she was relieved, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the storm had passed. She couldn't have been more wrong. Around midnight, Richard quietly got up and left the house. Lisa, exhausted from the emotional turmoil, didn't notice him slip out. He drove to the Harris house, parking a few streets away to avoid suspicion. The neighborhood was silent, the occasional bark of a distant dog, the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. He moved with purpose, his heart pounding as he approached the house. Ethan's bedroom was on the ground floor, and Richard knew from previous encounters that the window was often left unlocked. He crept towards it, his breath misting in the cool night air. With a trembling hand, he tested the window. It slid open easily, and he silently hoisted himself inside. Ethan was asleep, unaware of the danger looming over him. Richard stood there for a moment, staring at the boy who had ruined his life. Cold, calculating rage washed over him, and he felt his resolve harden. He pulled out the roll of duct tape and carefully, methodically, bound Ethan's hands and feet. The boy stirred, confused and groggy, but before he could react, Richard clamped the tape over his mouth, silencing his muffled cries. Ethan's eyes widened with terror as he realized who his attacker was. He struggled weakly, but Richard was relentless. He dragged Ethan off the bed and, despite his struggles, managed to lift him over his shoulder. Ethan's muffled screams were barely audible as Richard carried him back through the window and out into the night. Richard took him to the old abandoned tool shed behind the Alton house. It was a place he knew well, a place he could be alone, undisturbed. He dropped Ethan onto the cold, hard floor, his eyes blazing with fury as he watched the boy squirm and struggle. For a moment, he simply watched, his mind racing, the enormity of what he was about to do weighing heavily on him. "I trusted you," Richard finally said, his voice low and trembling with rage. "You came into my house. You ate my food. You looked me in the eye. And all this time, you were betraying me. You and her, both of you." His voice cracked, and he took a deep, shuddering breath. "But you're just a kid. She's the one who should have known better." Ethan tried to speak, to beg for his life, but the tape muffled his words. Richard ignored him, his eyes glazing over as he relived the moment he had found them together, the rage building inside him like a storm. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the knife. The blade gleamed in the dim light, and Ethan's eyes widened with terror as he saw it. Richard hesitated for a moment, the enormity of what he was about to do hitting him like a punch to the gut. But then he remembered Lisa's betrayal, the years of trust shattered in an instant. He thought of the humiliation, the pain, and he felt his resolve harden. With a low, guttural cry, he plunged the knife into Ethan's chest. Ethan's body convulsed as the blade pierced his flesh. His eyes locked onto Richard's, pleading, desperate, but Richard felt nothing. He pulled the knife out and plunged it in again, over and over, until the boy stopped moving, his body limp and lifeless on the ground. Richard stood there panting, his hands trembling as he stared at the bloody mess before him. The silence was deafening. For a moment, Richard couldn't move, couldn't think. He just stood there, staring at what he had done. Then, as if waking from a nightmare, he stumbled back, dropping the knife, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had done it. He had killed him, and now there was no going back. Richard stood in the shed, his hands shaking, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him like a heavy fog. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood, and Ethan's lifeless body lay crumpled on the ground. The reality of his actions began to settle in. Panic surged through him as he realized the gravity of his situation. He needed to get rid of the evidence, and fast. He glanced around the shed, his mind racing. His eyes fell on a large tarp in the corner. He grabbed it, unrolling it on the floor beside Ethan's body. With trembling hands, he lifted Ethan's limp form and wrapped it tightly in the tarp, securing it with the rope he'd bought earlier. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. He couldn't afford to lose it now. Richard dragged the heavy bundle across the yard, the effort leaving him drenched in sweat. He knew he had to be quick. It wouldn't be long before someone noticed Ethan's absence. He heaved the body into the trunk of his car, his heart pounding as he slammed it shut. He got into the driver's seat, his hands shaking violently as he started the engine and drove off into the night. He drove aimlessly for a while, his mind clouded with panic and fear. He couldn't think clearly, couldn't focus. His heart raced as he replayed the murder in his head, the sound of the knife plunging into its flesh echoing in his ears. He needed to dispose of the body, but where? The thought of burying it in the woods crossed his mind, but he dismissed it. Too risky. Too much could go wrong. As he drove along the deserted highway, his eyes caught sight of an old abandoned quarry. It was secluded, the perfect place to get rid of the evidence. He pulled over, his heart hammering in his chest as he looked around. The area was deserted, the darkness swallowing everything in sight. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he had to do. Richard popped the trunk and dragged the tarp-wrapped body out, his muscles straining under the weight. He stumbled towards the edge of the quarry, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. His breath came in ragged gasps as he looked down into the dark abyss below. It was deep enough. No one would find him here. With one last effort, he pushed the body over the edge. It tumbled down, disappearing into the darkness below with a sickening thud. Richard stood there for a moment, staring down into the void, his heart pounding in his ears. He had done it. He had gotten rid of the body. But as he stood there, a crushing wave of guilt and panic washed over him. What had he done? He had killed a boy, a stupid, foolish boy, but a boy nonetheless. He felt sick, his stomach twisting in knots. He turned and stumbled back to the car, his mind spinning. He had to get rid of the evidence, the knife, the bloody clothes. He drove back home in a daze, the enormity of his actions weighing heavily on him. He parked in the driveway, his hands shaking as he grabbed the knife and the clothes, shoving them into a bag. He went inside, the house eerily silent. Lisa was asleep on the couch, oblivious to the horror that had just unfolded. He stared at her for a moment, a surge of anger and resentment flooding through him. This was her fault too. She had driven him to this, pushed him over the edge, but it was too late to turn back now. Richard went to the backyard, his breath coming in short gasps as he doused the bag in lighter fluid and set it ablaze. The flames roared to life, consuming the evidence, licking at the night sky. He watched, numb as the fire burned away any trace of his crime. But even as the flames died down, the guilt remained. The reality of what he had done gnawed at him, cold, relentless fear settling in his chest. He knew it was only a matter of time before the police came knocking, before they pieced together the truth. He had been reckless, blinded by rage, and now he would pay the price. The next morning, Lisa woke up to find Richard sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. She asked him what was wrong, but he didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the horror of the night before. It wasn't long before the neighborhood buzzed with news of Ethan's disappearance. His parents were frantic, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen their son. By midday, the police were at the Altons' door, asking questions. Richard's heart raced as he tried to keep calm, his answers measured and careful, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The guilt was a heavy weight on his chest, the fear of being caught consuming him. It took the police less than 2 days to find the body in the quarry. The scene was gruesome, the brutality of the crime shocking even the most seasoned officers. Richard watched the news report from his living room, his hands shaking as they announced the discovery. He knew it was only a matter of time now. That night, as the house was shrouded in silence, the red and blue lights of the police cars flooded the driveway. Richard sat at the kitchen table, his heart heavy with the inevitability of it all. The knock on the door was loud, almost deafening. He stood up, his legs trembling, as he opened it to find the officers waiting. "Richard Alton, you're under arrest for the murder of Ethan Harris," one of the officers said, his voice cold and detached. Richard nodded, his hands trembling as they cuffed him. He glanced back at Lisa, who stood frozen, her face pale with shock and disbelief. As they led him away, Richard felt a strange sense of relief. The nightmare was over, and the consequences of his actions were finally catching up to him. He had killed in a fit of rage and jealousy, and now he would pay the ultimate price.